There is a kind of person most of us are familiar with. It could be a friend, a colleague, a family member, or sometimes it is none other than ourselves. It is the person who always says, "I'll be there in 5 minutes," yet in reality is still standing in front of the closet, hesitating between 2 shirts so similar that no one else could tell them apart. They may have already put on their shoes, locked the door, even stepped into the hallway, but then turn back inside just to finish a half-watched video, or absent-mindedly fold a shirt that they could very well have left until the evening. Sometimes, at the very moment they should be walking out the door, they suddenly start washing an extra glass, fixing their hair, or rearranging a corner of the desk for reasons no one can fully understand. From the outside, such behavior looks simple. Others easily conclude that they are careless, irresponsible, or worse, disrespectful of everyone's time. For those who are always punctual, the world seems to operate on discipline and precision. If you commit, you show up. If you say it, you do it. But for those who are chronically late, their rhythm of life resembles a soft, fluid stream, one that bends at any point, following no fixed rule. Yet, if we observe a little more closely, not with judgment, but with the curiosity of someone who wants to understand, we will notice something interesting. These people, despite appearing carefree, actually live with a sensitivity to time that is entirely different. They don't perceive time as clear, ticking seconds, but as something vague, expanding, shifting according to their emotions and thoughts in that very moment. They know they are late, they know others are waiting, and they know they themselves are tired of this cycle. But knowing is one thing, being able to change is something else entirely. Many of them walk quickly toward the meeting point, with a racing heartbeat, shortened breaths, and a quiet sense of guilt tightening like an invisible string inside their chest. They are not nearly as nonchalant as they might seem. In fact, every instance of being late comes with a touch of self-blame, a hint of embarrassment, and a silent promise to themselves. Next time, I'll be different. But then the familiar loop reappears, as though some force in their mind pulls them back into lateness, even when they genuinely want to escape it. What is strange is that this behavior appears with astonishing similarity across many people, regardless of their backgrounds, personalities, or circumstances, always believing they still have plenty of time, only to glance at the clock and realize it's already late. Being about to leave home, then suddenly wanting to finish a small, unrelated task. Prioritizing unnecessary things at moments that are already urgent, and especially, the classic line nearly everyone whispers to themselves, "I'll probably make it." Here, a series of questions begins to surface. Why do some people live like human clocks, always arriving on time, sometimes even early, while others struggle with time as though it is something that refuses to stay still? Why is punctuality natural for some, yet for others it feels like a recurring challenge? And more importantly, what is happening inside the minds of those people in the moment between knowing they should step out the door and the moment when everything has already become too late? You might think this is someone else's story, but if you have ever once run while thinking, "Why am I like this?" or sent a message saying "almost there," while knowing you might not actually make it, then perhaps you are looking into a part of your own self. Being late is not merely a behavior, it is a sign, a crack in the psychological structure we rarely notice. And sometimes, it tells more about who we are than we expect. Because being late doesn't begin with the feet. It begins inside the mind, where time is not the hands of a clock, but a reflection of what we have yet to fully understand about ourselves. There is one thing most of us misunderstand, that people who arrive late are people who don't care. We see them show up after the agreed time, and we assume they don't value anyone's time. We watch them walk into a meeting as if nothing is wrong, and we think they are careless, irresponsible. But that is only the surface, the first layer of a story far more intricate. If we slow down a little to observe, to look past the calm facade they wear, we begin to see, no one is late because they want to be. They are late because they are hiding something deeper. Within these people often lies a blurry space they themselves don't quite know how to name. Sometimes it is the fear of facing the dry, rigid reality of life, pushing them to steal a few more seconds of daydreaming before stepping into a new day. Sometimes it is a sense of unease that creeps in whenever they arrive early, as if someone's gaze might be following their every breath, making them only feel safe entering a room once it is full enough to conceal their awkwardness. Sometimes it is a mind that never rests, spinning between thoughts like, did I do something wrong? Or, what if someone thinks I'm strange? And while they try to make everything perfect, time slips away quietly. But there are moments when lateness is the final act of resistance of a soul afraid of being controlled. They do not arrive on time because punctuality feels like an invisible command forcing them to conform. They want to believe they are still free, that life hasn't boxed them into a mold they never chose. And sometimes, in situations seemingly simple, the reason someone is late comes from a heart that tries to give too much. They say yes to everyone except themselves. They are stretched so thin that no time remains for their own needs, and eventually, what they lose is not the appointment, it's their own presence. These stories are not separate threads, they are different currents of the same psychological river, where each person is trying to hide a fear, an emptiness, a fragment inside themselves that they haven't learned to name. The dreamer, the anxious one, the overthinker, the quiet rebel, the overwhelmed soul. They all share one thing. They are trying to perform the role of, I'm fine, while within them lies a silent vortex they have never dared to acknowledge. And this creates the greatest paradox. The person we think is careless is often the one holding themselves together the hardest. They don't say it. They don't explain. They don't want anyone to know that each time they arrive late, they are waging an internal battle against the fear of being seen too clearly, against the dread of doing something wrong, against the instinct to protect themselves, or against the exhaustion of a heart stretched to its limits. When we understand this, we begin to see a truth that overturns everything we once believed. Lateness is not merely a behavior. It is a signal, a reminder that behind every human being is an inner world we rarely see. A reminder that where we assume irresponsibility, there may lie someone hiding their pain. A reminder that no one enters life intending to inconvenience others. They are simply trying to survive within the bounds their soul allows. And when that curtain lifts, we begin to see it more clearly. It's not that they are late, it's that they have not yet managed to catch up with themselves. When we see someone arrive later than planned, we often assume they are irresponsible, careless, or disrespectful of other people's time. But that is only the surface what our eyes can register. Beneath every human action lies a quiet psychological system at work, and when that curtain is lifted, we begin to realize, being late is not a simple habit. It is a complex story of the mind, emotions, and the invisible wounds each person carries. For some people, time doesn't flow in clear, measured ticks the way most imagine it does. In their minds, time is like an elastic band, something that can stretch a little more, and then a little more. Without them noticing it, is on the verge of snapping. They believe they can squeeze in one more task, finish one more quick chore, or process one more tangled thought. Not because they dismiss the value of time, but because their brain genuinely miscalculates it. Psychology calls this the planning fallacy, a form of temporal optimism in which the mind trims away the tiny, inconvenient details we tend to overlook. Searching for keys, waiting for the elevator, getting stuck in traffic, pausing for a moment to fix our clothes. These small moments, when added together, create delays they never intended. Others live in a world where arriving early feels like being exposed. The moment they walk into a nearly empty room, they become hyper-aware of their own presence, as if a spotlight were shining directly on them. Their brains are so sensitive to social cues that they only feel safe entering a space once it is warm, full, alive enough for them to blend into. For them, being late is not a style. It is a way of protecting themselves from the moments in which they feel most vulnerable. And then there are those who live as if standing at the center of 100 branching paths. They overthink every small decision: what to wear, when to arrive, what to say when they meet someone, how to act so as not to be misunderstood. Their mind runs faster than their body, and while they are still busy arranging their thoughts, time flows away like a quiet stream. They are not slow because they are lazy. They are slow because they are battling an invisible storm within. But amid all this complexity, There is a scientific truth powerful enough to shift anyone's perspective. Research shows that 70% of chronic lateness does not stem from a lack of discipline, but from anxiety and distorted time perception. A simple statement, yet strong enough to overturn all the judgments we tend to place on latecomers. Because if the issue is not rooted in willpower, but in how their brain processes pressure, risk, and the gaze of others, then lateness is no longer a bad habit, but a natural outcome of survival mechanisms developed over many years. For some, lateness is a form of soft resistance, an unconscious response psychology calls reactance. When they feel forced, even by a mild social rule like be on time, their brain immediately generates a quiet pushback, as though they must defend the last scraps of freedom they believe they still possess. In such cases, being late becomes a subtle reminder that they still get to choose their own rhythm, even if that rhythm sometimes causes them pain. And finally, there are people whose hearts are simply too wide. They give their time to everyone. They take on more tasks, more responsibilities, more of other people's sorrow. And by the time night falls, they realize they have forgotten the one person who needed their care the most, themselves. Their lateness becomes the inevitable result of a heart that hasn't learned how to set boundaries, like a piece of fabric pulled in too many directions until it loses its original shape. When we understand all of this, we begin to believe in a very different truth. Being late does not mean a person is irresponsible. It means they are struggling with the deepest parts of themselves. And from that moment on, we no longer look at them with judgment, but with clarity, because we finally see that what delays them is not their feet, but the layers of psychology they have not yet learned how to untangle. There are moments in life when we believe we understand something completely, a behavior, a person, a personality, but then, at some point, we realize that what we see is only a thin mist hiding a deeper current beneath. And with the habit of being late, this moment arrives now. Because the more we observe, analyze, and look into the psychological layers behind the behavior, the more we begin to recognize something no one has ever told us. Being late is not a story about clocks. It is a story about the inner world. We have grown so used to seeing lateness as a flaw, a carelessness, a sign of irresponsibility. But when we look at what truly drives this behavior, the fear of being exposed, the storms of overthinking, the old wounds still lingering, the unconscious resistance, the heart that wants to please everyone, we begin to see that what we've been blaming all this time is merely the surface of a much deeper fracture. That habit, from beginning to end, has never belonged to time. It belongs to the human being. We start to understand that some people are not late because they don't try, but because they have been trying for far too long. They live in hyper-awareness, in anxiety, in the pressure to be perfect, in the fear of disappointing someone, in the scars of being controlled, in the need to prove their worth. And while we may think they are carefree, thoughtless, they are in fact carrying burdens we never knew existed. This is the moment of cognitive rupture. The moment the mind cracks open. It's not that they are late, they simply haven't caught up with themselves yet. And when this truth reveals itself, we begin to see an entire life behind an action that once seemed so small. We see the child who once stood under critical eyes, learning to delay things in fear of being wrong. We see the young adult who learned to smile at the right time to please everyone, until time was no longer something they owned, but something pulled away by too many hands. We see the exhausted adult, constantly running after responsibilities, trying so hard not to disappoint anyone, but leaving themselves behind. We see the souls that once lived under control, once forced to obey, and now respond to time with a quiet sigh. I want at least one thing in my life to still belong to me. When we can see all that, judgment dissolves like smoke, because we understand that lateness is not a sign of stubbornness, but a sign of fragility. Not a sign of irresponsibility, but of exhaustion. Not a sign of defiance, but of someone protecting themselves from emotions they are not yet ready to face. And then, something beautiful happens. We don't just see them differently, we see ourselves differently. Because perhaps, somewhere in our own lives, we too have arrived late to a part of ourselves. Late to our healing. Late to saying the truth. Late to listening to our own heart. late to giving ourselves a new chance, late to stepping out of what has hurt us for too long. And like them, we are not to blame. We are simply not yet ready, not yet able to breathe, not yet able to understand ourselves, not yet able to place a hand on the wound we've hidden too deeply, not yet able to realize that we, too, deserve to be on time for our own life. A moment of awakening is not a moment that breaks us. It is the moment that lets us see, to see truth, to see people, to see the self, to see fear, to see the parts of ourselves we have scolded for far too long. And when we can finally see, we no longer close our hearts. We open them, open to understand, open to empathize, open to heal. Because in the end, the thing no one ever told us is this: being late is not a problem of time. Being late is a sign of a tired soul. And every tired soul needs to be understood long before it can be repaired. When the mask has been peeled away, when the psychological mechanisms have been illuminated, what remains is the deepest layer, where there are no behaviors left to explain, no excuses to hide behind, only the existential forces quietly moving within every person who arrives late. At this depth, the story is no longer about time. It is about a self trying to survive. Here, one begins to see clearly that their lateness is not a simple choice, but a response to internal impulses they cannot control. Some people are late because within them exists a subtle fear, the fear of being seen. Arriving early, for them, is stepping into a spotlight they are not ready to face. They delay a few minutes not to challenge anyone, but to soften the feeling of being exposed, judged, scrutinized. Their slowness is not a lack of respect. It is the expression of an inner truth in which showing up on time feels like standing bare in front of others before they are ready. Some people are late because they associate time with freedom. Schedules, rules, punctuality, all of it reminds them of years in which they were controlled, dictated to, stripped of choice. And so their ego learns to protect its last fragment of freedom through a few minutes of delay. Outsiders see rebellion, but inside, it is an act of preserving a piece of dignity, a small voice whispering, "I still get to decide what belongs to me." Their lateness, strangely enough, becomes their affirmation that they exist. Others arrive late because they carry a heart too accustomed to living for everyone else. They take on more tasks, more responsibilities, more favors, as though they were born to fill every gap around them. They do not know how to refuse, do not dare to set boundaries, cannot bear the thought of disappointing anyone. And among the hundreds of obligations weighing on their shoulders, they themselves become the last person they remember. They are not late because they are careless. They are late because their kindness has stretched them so thin that no time remains for their own being. And there are those who are late because inside them is a quiet voice whispering, "It's not enough yet." They adjust their clothes, check everything again, rethink their steps before walking out the door. No one sees that this delay is born from a deep-rooted insecurity, the feeling that they must appear perfect to be worthy. They are not late because they are disorganized, but because they have never felt good enough. These truths reveal something heartbreaking. Lateness at its deepest level is the echo of wounds that have never been named. It is the fear of being judged, the fear of revealing weakness, the fear of being controlled, the fear of hurting someone, the fear of not being worthy. It is not a battle with time, but a battle with the person they are inside. They run not to arrive late, but to escape a feeling that chokes them. And when we see them through this lens, we discover something profoundly human. People who arrive late are not trying to hurt anyone. They are simply trying to survive in a world where their inner life is always too loud. But it is precisely here that a door opens. For if the behavior rises from deep internal forces, then healing does not come from the clock, but from releasing the fears that have governed them for so long. When they begin to understand what their ego has been fighting against, when they dare to look at the pain instead of running from it, lateness is no longer the hardened shield of the self. It becomes an invitation to return to the fragile human within, the part of themselves they forgot to care for. And in that moment, liberation begins. Not liberation from being late, but liberation from the very armor that once forced them to live as someone who never managed to keep up with life. When a person moves through the deepest layers of their fears, when they finally see the wounds hidden behind their behaviors, a particular moment begins to appear. A moment when they see themselves not through the eyes of judgment, but through the gaze of understanding. It is the moment when the ego stops resisting, the moment the mind stops running away, the moment a human being, for the first time, stands on their own side. They realize that for so many years, what exhausted them was not the act of chasing time, but the act of chasing other people's expectations. They wanted to be on time, not because they truly desired it, but because they feared disappointment. They tried to be perfect, not because they loved precision, but because they feared they were not enough. Their entire life, unconsciously, had been a journey to find safety beneath the shell of their lateness. But then, at some point, when truth is illuminated, they begin to see something they had never dared to consider. They were not born to chase time. They were born to live by their own rhythm. And in that moment, a gentle, yet powerful crescendo arises. Not an explosion, not a dramatic collapse, but something like the sun emerging after days of rain. Warm, still, unmistakably clear. So, it wasn't the lateness that hurt them all these years. It was the fact that they had never stood with themselves. This awakening doesn't arrive like a distant philosophical truth. It arrives like breath, soft, clear, full. They realize that healing does not begin with correcting behavior, but with listening to the emotions that have been abandoned for far too long. When they stop condemning themselves, when they allow themselves to be imperfect, when they understand that they deserve gentleness. Time, for the first time, softens. The person who once was always late, who once ran through the chaos of their inner world, suddenly feels as though someone has placed a hand on their shoulder and whispered, "You don't have to run anymore." They see themselves as if standing before a mirror whose fog has finally lifted. A person who is real, fragile, but also profoundly beautiful. Not an image of inadequacy, but an image of a self worn thin from trying to become what the world wanted. And when they begin to stand with themselves, the questions that once tormented them begin to change. Why am I always late? Shifts into, what do I need right now? Why can't I be on time? Shifts into, what emotion in me has been forgotten? That moment is a philosophical rebirth, where attempts to control oneself are replaced by understanding, where heavy expectations give way to compassion, where the inner noise finally quiets. This is not a change in behavior. This is a change in being. The person who once arrived late no longer feels like a victim of time. They feel as though they are walking with time, not faster, not slower, but in the rhythm that is truly theirs. And this is the most beautiful moment of all, when they understand that as long as they stand with themselves, time will stand with them too. Because, in the end, existential awakening is not about learning how to be punctual. It is about reclaiming the truest part of oneself, the part that was forgotten after years of running after the eyes of the world. And when a human being returns to that essence, life is no longer an endless chase. It becomes a journey, slow enough to hear one's own heart, bright enough to see the path ahead, and spacious enough to hold everything they once feared to face. This is the peace they had always been searching for, and it turns out, it was never ahead of them. It was always within. When a person has gone through the journey of recognizing, peeling back, understanding, and finally standing with themselves, they step into a new space, the space of tranquility. It is not the tranquility of someone who has won, but the tranquility of someone who no longer needs to fight. They no longer see time as a figure holding a whip behind them, urging them to keep up, to become something, to prove something. Time now resembles a gentle stream, calm enough for them to see their own reflection, clear enough for them to recognize the path they wish to walk next. Someone who once was always late, who once panicked in rushed mornings, who once shrank away from other people's eyes, now begins to feel something simple yet profound. Time has never been against them. They simply had never lived in the rhythm of their own being. When they understand this, the shame they carried for so long dissolves like mist over a lake, because they realize that life never asked them to be perfect in every minute. If life asks for anything at all, it is sincerity. And when they show up sincerely, aligned with their own essence, time becomes gentle. They begin to know how to pause and breathe, to say no when their heart is tired, to listen to the whisper of their inner self, instead of the noise of expectations, to enter a room not to please others, but to avoid betraying themselves. This is not a loud transformation. There is no applause, no miraculous moment captured in the air, but inside them, something has truly shifted. A person who once feared arriving early can now be on time, not because they force themselves, but because they no longer fear their own presence. A person who once rebelled against time no longer resists, because freedom now comes from within, not from a few minutes of delay. A person once pulled in 100 directions now keeps a small space for themselves, a space they had long forgotten. And it is this gentle shift that makes them tranquil. A tranquility that is deeply human, deeply real, deeply alive. Someone who understands time is someone who understands their own limits. They no longer try to do everything. They no longer try to please everyone. They no longer tighten themselves in an effort to prove anything. They choose to live at the pace of their own heartbeat. And when they live like this, time becomes a companion, not fast, not slow, but exactly enough. Enough for them to breathe. Enough for them to smile upon arriving at a meeting. Enough for them to know that whether they come a little early or a little late, they are still a human being worthy of love. Enough for them to believe they are living, not racing. This is the greatest gift that self-understanding brings. Peace does not come from controlling time, but from being at harmony with oneself. And when a person is in harmony with themselves, the world is no longer a place they must chase. The world becomes a place they can walk through gently, slowly, mindfully, with tension and release, and finally with life. Being late, once a source of shame, of self-blame, of feeling not enough, becomes nothing more than an old footprint on a path they have already crossed. A gentle reminder that everyone, at some point, is unready, uncertain, still searching for their true rhythm. But when they reach the far shore, they understand something profoundly beautiful. No one is ever truly late when they are on the journey of returning to themselves. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of time. It is not measured in minutes or seconds, but in the sincerity of a soul and the calmness of a human being who has learned to stand with themselves